It's much better. Okay. So, thanks everybody for sticking around on Sunday. We've had some great Python talks so far. How about a talk for a little bit that is less language specific? Let's talk about docs. My name is Brian MacDonald. I work on the docs team at Temporal, and let's rock and roll. Or we will in a second. There we go. Okay. Lots of different types of docs out there, each with a different purpose, each with a different design for that purpose. But for this talk, I'm going to divide them into one of two buckets, which is to say references and tutorials. Now, these are very different, and they have different intents and different UXs. So let's talk about that. Reference docs are comprehensive. You want it to cover everything. They focus on the product. What's the product do? What's it made for? And the intent is for quick retrieval. That's the UX. If you think about it, the ultimate reference is a dictionary. You know what the word is, you look it up very quickly, you get the definition, you go on with your day. Quick retrieval is what references are designed for. Most people don't read a dictionary front to back. Oops. So here's an example of reference documentation. This is API docs from my former employer, DigitalOcean. So you see the commands, you see the options, you see that there's even a nice little place for you to test it out and see what the output looks like. That's great. This works very well for API docs. What this isn't, however, is readable. You're not going to sit down and read all the way through this. Why would you? It's not what it's designed for. So, tutorial docs, in contrast, are not comprehensive. They focus on the things that the reader wants to do most. So the focus stays on the user, which is what helps to keep them more engaged. And tutorial style docs are meant to be read from beginning to end. So here's an example. This is a tutorial from, again, my former employer, DigitalOcean, on how to install Apache. Take a look at the nav bar on the side there. You'll see the headings listed there, and you'll notice that they contain verbs: installing, adjusting, checking, monitoring. That's because each of these tutorial steps is focused on something that the user wants to accomplish. So, bringing back the title of the talk, references are nouns. They tell you what something is. And when you organize by noun, you get something that looks like this, documentation-wise. This is a very old third-party doc from Microsoft Word. But you've seen docs like this. Hey, we're going to show you the file menu. I will now list all the items on the file menu in order. And the problem with this is that it puts equal weight on each of the options. So for example, you might want to open a file or save a file. Those are things you do a lot. But page setup, that's not something that you do very often. And yet this doc is treating it as if they were equivalent. Now, it's easy to make fun of old Microsoft documentation, but you might have also seen a doc that starts with something like this. This, incidentally, is a Kubernetes cluster running on Azure connected to a SQL database and like 5 other things. Who's seen a doc that looks like this, has something like this at the top of the first page? Right. What's happening when you give the user something like this is you're saying, okay, user, you don't have any context for any of this, but I want you to remember all of that until some point later in the documentation when it's going to make sense. This is actually a fairly normal thing to do from an engineering mindset because the engineer who created this thing thinks about it like this. But as the user coming to it, you can't think about it like this yet because you don't have the context. So, in contrast, if references are nouns, then tutorials are verbs. They tell you how to do something. Let's look at that Apache tutorial again. So we've got installing Apache as step 1, but we've also got adjusting the firewall, checking the web server, managing the process, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of these is a single thing you want to do. If a user comes to this and they've already got Apache installed, but what they need to do is configure the firewall, they can go right to that and find the thing that they're looking for. Now, when you're talking about verbs like this, not all verbs are created equal. You want to look for verbs that have an action in them. Things like create or monitor or configure. And the way to think about this is there should be a change of state associated with that verb in the system. So if I go to configure my firewall, beforehand it's not configured, afterwards it is. I have changed the state. The firewall is now configured. These verbs are not so strong for tutorial types of documentation. Understand, learn, know. This is another trap that people fall into. Step 2 is going to be understanding the architecture of my Kubernetes cluster. Well, that's great, but it doesn't actually change the state of the system. In other words, the user hasn't done anything. The only state that's changed is in the user's mind, which is fine, but that's not the point. The user doesn't necessarily want to understand your Kubernetes cluster, they want to set one up. That's what they're here for. So, you can make a modification to that. So for example, look at the sentence on top. You'll learn how to add a server to your cluster. Well, what the user actually wants to do here is not to learn how to do that. They want a server in their cluster. That's the goal. So you can simply remove learn how to, and the sentence is fine the way it is. Now you'll add a server to your cluster, and then you go on to explain that. You'll understand how to configure your firewall. You don't even have to refer to the user as you. This is what we're doing now. We're configuring the firewall. That's what they want to accomplish. That's why we put the verb up front. Now, been talking about this in kind of a broad way, and you might be thinking, okay, well, how do I apply that? And the way to do that is when you start with that blank page, you want to start with the verbs. And that means, yes, you're going to make an outline. And if you are currently having flashbacks to 4th grade English, I apologize. It probably won't be the last time in this talk. But I have a 2-phase methodology for making outlining somewhat less painful. So, to outline the doc, the first thing you want to do is think about what is it that you intended for your users to do. You created the feature. You probably had something in mind when you were creating it. What did you want them to do? Was there more than one thing? Are there edge cases involved? If your product is already out in the world, users are using it, ask them, what are you using this for? It may not be the same as the list you made the first time. In fact, if anybody here has a product with more than, say, 10 users, I can pretty much guarantee that there is a user out there using it in a way you never thought of, which in fact might horrify you. But that's still valid. That is a way that a user is using it. So if your users exist in the world, you can go and ask them. Now, this is the key to phase 1 is to write down everything. Don't think, oh, that's out of scope. Don't think, oh, that's too simple. Don't think, oh, that's, too much of a fine point. In phase 1, you write down everything. You are making a pile of stuff, and that's all you're doing. This is going to take a little time. Sometimes, you can sit down and say, all right, these are the things that I wanted people to do with my feature. Some of it's going to come to you later while you're using the product. Some of it's going to come to you 2 days later in the shower. Wait a bit to write that down. But over time, eventually you'll run out of the things that you want the users to do. Now, I did say don't throw things out, but I do want to say define discrete steps. So look for if any of those tasks that you've written down are overly broad. So, for example, if I wrote down configure the firewall, that might take a handful of sub-steps. I might have to adjust the IP tables. I might have to select certain ports. I might have to grant certain permissions. So write down all of those as well, these sub-steps that are part of the larger task. Don't throw out the larger task, keep that. So when all of this is done, that's the end of phase 1. Phase 2 You take the pile of stuff and then you start to organize it. Define the use cases. Look at your list of things, the tasks that you've written down, and say, hey, some of these are beginner tasks. Some of these are advanced tasks. Some of these, they're not in scope. So don't throw those away, but put them aside in a different document. You might need it later. Okay, now I made that sound really easy, right? How does this work in reality? And is this man crazy enough to do a live demo in a docs talk? Yes, I am. What we're going to do here, we're going to document or create an outline for a document of a browser. It's a browser that does what browsers do. It's not revolutionary or special. It's the platonic ideal of browsers, if you will. So let's start brainstorming. What do we want a browser to do? Hit me up. Go to a website. Okay. Oop. All right, heard one over here? Anybody? Follow links. Bookmark a link.
Maintain history.
Maintain history. Wait, I heard something over there. What?
Render a page.
Download a file.
Render a page.
All right. Did I hear something about cookies? Okay. All right. I'm going to add one on here because somebody always says this, and I'm sure somebody was thinking. Okay. So most of these have verbs in the start. Let's focus on the one that didn't for a second. Cookies. What do I want to do with a cookie? Several things. All right, let's do this then. Okay. So now that I've run out of space on the page, we'll truncate this for time, but all right, the first activity, go to a website. Show of hands, who thinks that's a beginner activity? Okay, anybody think intermediate or advanced? All right, so let's make that green. Follow links. Who thinks that's a beginner activity? Yeah? Okay. We'll call that green again. Bookmark a link. Beginners? Who thinks beginner? Who thinks intermediate? All right, I'd say we're there. We'll call that orange because you won't be able to see the yellow. Maintain history. Who thinks that's beginner? Intermediate? Anybody for advanced? Okay, I think we'll consensus on intermediate for that one. Download a file. Beginners? Intermediate? That's on the border, so you might make a note of that. We've only got 3 categories here, but so render a page. Is that going to be a beginner activity? It's going to be different because we've defined it differently. So these might be different audiences, right? A basic end user might go to a website, whereas someone who's writing the page might want to use the browser to test it, to render. And in that case, I would say that seems like an advanced activity, yes? Okay. Oop. Deleting the cookies. Beginner activity? Intermediate? Advanced? Okay. And I think we've decided already that viewing the source is advanced. So by my timer, that took about 2 minutes, maybe 3. We took a brand new concept, a piece of software that doesn't exist yet. We brainstormed some tasks, and now we've outlined them. So if we were going to write the documentation for a brand new beginner user of this browser, we might isolate the green things. Then we might isolate the orange items for later, or if we're targeting developers with our documentation, start with the red stuff. So that only took a couple of minutes to do, and we've identified the verbs. So, demo of the brainstorming task. Now, We identified some tasks which we're going to use as major headings. Within the major headings, you're going to have some steps. Let's talk a little bit about those because we're still going to look for the verbs. Consider your audience. So for the sake of this discussion, we'll assume our audience, we're going to stick with the browser. The audience is somebody who's never used a browser before. They're a time traveler from 1994. So how should they use a browser? Enter the URL, press enter. Okay, well, we've got verbs there. Enter the URL, press enter. This is looking a little bit incomplete for a novice user. So we want the steps to be complete and in the right order. So in this case, we'll assume if our time travelers from 94, they know how to use a mouse and a keyboard, so we can tell them to start the browser. Then we'll tell them to click in the address bar, maybe with a nice screenshot, type in the URL and press enter. Okay, all of this works, but we have still one point of confusion. Our time traveler doesn't know what a URL is. This is where the background information comes in. We call this just-in-time learning. We put in a definition of what's a URL. A web address is called a URL and represents a location you can go to on the web. We put that at the point where the user needs to know it. Now, we could have, at the beginning of this documentation, explained how browsers work and talked about the server-client model and IP addressing and the OSI model and all of that. But that wouldn't have done our time traveler any good at the beginning of the documentation. Here, where they're actually typing in the web address, we give them just the information they need to know to continue the task. And then if they want to look up the details of the OSI model, maybe we'll provide a link and God help them. So, keep these things short. I'm going to cheat here and go back to the Apache tutorial. Notice that we fit a step on this slide. That's because each step consists of one major chunk of action. You've gone far enough to get the basic thing installed and to then start the configuration. And the reason that we stopped there is because of cognitive load. If you're very familiar with installing Apache, you might say, oh yeah, well this is pretty easy, I can just blow through these 5 steps. But if you've never done that before, then you're gonna have an issue with getting all of these done. You want to have a stop point, a rest stop on the highway, if you will, to say, okay, I'm gonna stop and evaluate how is this going, is this working the way I expect it to? I don't know how many of you drive on major highways, but you'll notice there are more rest stops than you actually need to use. You don't need to stop at every one of them, and the reader doesn't necessarily need to stop every time we pause in the instructions, but it's there if they need to, and that's the point. So, enough about steps. Let's take this down a little more granular, talk about the paragraph level. So again, you want to try and keep things concise at the paragraph level. If step is a subsection, then each paragraph consists of one action. I got a little tired of the Apache while I was writing this, so I switched to Nginx for equal time. This is by another one of my colleagues, Alex Garnett. So you'll notice that each of the paragraphs consists of a single sentence. To add the repository, use the following command. Then he tells you, press Y to confirm. Then now that you have it, you install the required packages and we give you another command. Everything here is very concise and short. Now, if you're an experienced sysadmin, you're probably saying, but wait a minute, you could combine those 2 commands. And yes, you could. For a more experienced user, that's the way you would do it. But for a novice user who hasn't done this before, we're assuming that they need to be told each step individually. And there's no harm in that. If they end up doing this 3 times a day for a week, yes, they'll start to find the shortcuts and go faster. But for the purposes of someone who might only be doing this the once or once every 6 months, then we provide more detail. Make sure your paragraphs are relevant. For each paragraph, you should be able to look back at the step title and say, all right, does this paragraph serve the goal that we've put in the step title? Is this going to help us move to the next verb? If you find yourself veering off from the point, you might be trending into that background information place where you're giving information that the user doesn't need in that context. Subheadings. Engineers like hierarchies. So in this case, we're saying installing Apache and configuring Apache are two tasks with equal weight. Except installing Apache is really just the one command, whereas configuring Apache is going to be all of these substeps. And while you're saying, okay, yes, that's the conceptual hierarchy, there's two things here, that's not the way the reader's going to experience it. They're going to run this first command, and then they're going to do each of these sub things. So fix that by promoting the subheadings to be major headings. The major headings are tasks that you're going to be using. And you may find, once you've done this, that your step 2, configuring Apache, that was just a bucket holding the other things, so you don't really need it anymore. Let's take this down a little bit further to the sentence level. Find some verbs here. So we look for the verb. This sentence, the firewall settings are the next thing you need to change to open the config file to do that. You've told the reader why, and then you've told them what to do. But the thing you really want them to do at this point is open the file. So that's the primary verb. You can move it to the front of the sentence, and it means the same thing. Open the config file to change the firewall settings. We've still explained it. We still gave it context, but we moved it to the front of the sentence, which makes the sentence more powerful and more engaging. Use the active voice. Again, there's that flashback, sorry. The new user command is used to create a new user. Yeah, I bet it is. So, but what we don't see here is who's doing the action. Have we told them to do anything? We haven't. We've just described this command. So to flip this around to active voice, create a new user with the user command. Now you're speaking directly to the reader, and you're telling them what to do by moving that verb to the front of the sentence. One way to look for passive voice, and it's usually a fairly successful way, if you find yourself using an auxiliary verb, is, are, was, were, that's a sign that you may be using passive voice. It's not a guarantee, but it's a pretty good indication. If your verb is actually several words, might be passive voice. Notice in the second sentence, you've got one verb, create. Keep things short. You configure the firewall by opening the config file for editing, navigating, and then adding the ports and saving the file. I've put 4 verbs in this sentence. So, while this is something that you could do, you could also, if there's 4 verbs, give them 4 sentences. Configure the firewall, navigate to the port section, add the ports, save the file. And if I weren't doing this on a slide that I expect you all to read, I'd probably make these separate paragraphs too. So, can I actually go down to the word level? Yes, I can. That's called tone, but I'm not going to do it in this talk. So, there is a longer version of this talk. You can find the slides on GitHub. There's also a link there to a video of the longer version of this talk. But for the moment, I'm just going to leave you with a few thoughts. So, when you're writing, look for the verbs, focus on what the users want to do, move the verbs up front. Okay.